Hello, everyone. We are just going to get started here in about 15 seconds. Hello, everyone, and welcome. We'll get started here in just a few seconds. Good afternoon, and welcome to Indiana Youth Institute's webinar. Today's session is updates on youth issues from the legislative session. My name is Joshua Long. I'm the Senior Educational Content Manager at IYI, and we are just so glad that you've joined us for today's presentation. And we're also grateful to have the chance to connect as a community of youth workers that remain committed to the needs of our youth and children. For those who are not familiar with IYI, our mission is to improve the lives of all Indiana children by strengthening and connecting the people, organizations, and communities that are focused on kids and youth. Listed here, you can see our vision that drives the work we do for Indiana youth. And before we begin, I'd like to share a few pointers that will help you engage with today's webinar. For any technical support, use the chat feature to send a message, and Aaron Whitcomb, IYI's registration manager, is behind the scenes to assist you. Use this feature to converse with the group as well. You can also, we'll also send a copy of today's PowerPoint via email, and the recording will be made available on IYI.org. We encourage you to ask questions, so please use the Q&A feature for any you may have, and we will get to as many as possible. Later today, you will receive an email with a link to complete an evaluation of this webinar. Please take a few minutes to let us know your thoughts about today's presentation. And if you don't receive the evaluation email, check your junk, as it may have been directed there. Once you complete the evaluation, you will be redirected to your certificate of participation. Like all of IYI's webinars, today's webinar will be posted on our website if you'd like to revisit a portion later or share the opportunity to listen in with partners. And it is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Sarah Kumpfer is the Director of Public Policy and Advocacy at the Marion County Commission on Youth. In this position, she meets with Indiana legislators to advocate for policy decisions that affect the youth in our community. She joins McCoy following 6 years in Washington, D.C., working in government and at a nonprofit. She served as a staff member for U.S. Senator Joe Donnelly, then as a senior program associate at Meridian International Center. She holds a bachelor's degree from Indiana University in Political Science and Spanish and a master's degree in Global Advocacy from the George Washington University, and she is fluent in Spanish. And so we look forward to today's presentation, and so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Sarah. You are muted, Sarah.
So sorry about that. Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah. So good to see you all here today. Thank you so much for joining. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and then we can get started. So yeah, as Josh said, my name is Sarah Kumpfer. I'm Public Policy and Advocacy Director at McCoy. You may also know us as Marion County Commission on Youth. You have my contact information here at the bottom. So please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any follow-up questions after this, or if you're interested in getting involved in advocacy work. I would love to speak more with you about that. So I'm just going to get right in there, just share a little bit of information about Indiana State Legislature for those who might not be as familiar. So we do have a part-time legislature. This particular year, 2023, was a long session. It's because we discussed the budget. In Indiana, in the state legislature, we discuss the budget every other year. So anytime that the budget is discussed, it's long. If it's not discussed, so next year and also last year, those are considered to be short sessions. So it always starts basically right after the holidays, right after New Year's. This year in 2023, the first day of session was January 9th. The midpoint was about the end of February. And then the last day was at the very end of April. That's called sine die, and that's essentially the day of adjournment. In short sessions, so what we're going to see next year, we're going to wrap up probably at mid-March or so. With that said, just because we're a part-time legislature doesn't mean that we don't work full-time in terms of advocating for young people in our state. So with that said, as I mentioned, January through March is typically the length of session in non-budget years. In budget years, the long sessions, those go until about the end of April. But also in the summer, we have what's called interim study committees. I just got a notification that the first study committee has been scheduled. I believe they're going to be discussing public health. I need to look more into it, but that's scheduled for, I believe, the end of August. So with that said, even though there's summer study committees, I mean, we're seeing the first one that's scheduled is at the end of August. Sometimes they go well into September and October. But those are times where legislators meet just to discuss particular issues of interest. For example, last year when there was a lot of discussion about what should and should not be taught in schools, legislators decided we really need to learn more about what sort of mental health resources currently exist for students in Indiana at schools. And so they suggested having a summer study committee to discuss that. So that's just kind of like an example of like, if they didn't get a chance to pass legislation on a particular issue one time, then they use the summertime to kind of meet together, dive a little deeper, bring in experts to learn more about that. So that's what summer study committees are. And then come fall, you're going to see more reports and recommendations and then actual drafting of legislation. So coming up, if you have an idea that you would like to see passed as a bill in Indiana, basically any time now, you could really reach out to your legislator to suggest that. So then that way they can work all fall with the Legislative Services Agency to be able to draft the bill and everything. With that said, I will just do a quick refresher for those of us who forget, how bills become a law. Everybody loves seeing the familiar Schoolhouse Rock bill in the background here, but I use him a lot when explaining things. I won't go too deep into it, but I know, some of us probably haven't studied how a bill becomes a law since, high school. So with that said, the idea is first developed. That's happening basically now. And then in the fall, that's when the bills are drafted. That's when you work with legislators and then the Legislative Services Agency to be able to actually come up with the full bill text. And so with that said, I also have included some of the deadlines from this past year just to kind of give you a chronological idea of like when in the calendar legislative year these events occurred. So the bill is drafted and then it needs to be filed before it's introduced. The deadline to file bills is pretty quickly right after the legislative session starts. So that's why, legislators try and have everything already written out and everything before the legislative session begins. First step is the bill is introduced and referred to a respective committee. If the bill is introduced by a House member, that's called a House bill, and you'll see that it's called HB and then followed by a series of 4 numbers. If it's introduced by a senator, it's a Senate bill, and so then that's SB. So later on, when I go over some of the bills that have passed into law, you'll see they're either HB, House bill, or SB, Senate bill. So those are all introduced. The ones that have been filed, and then they're referred to a respective committee. It's pretty straightforward. If the bill impacts schools, then it's going to be sent to an education committee. If it impacts our roads and funding for road development, that'll be sent to the transportation committee and so on. And there's a bunch of different committees that you can look up online to see, what's out there and what might be of interest. The committees that I pay attention to a lot are human services committees. There's a family and child welfare committee, education committee, criminal justice committee, that just to deal with juvenile justice issues and things like that. And then committee action takes place. This is the opportunity for all of us to actually show up, if we're able to, show up to the State House and be able to provide testimony and be able to share our experiences, our expertise, and our stories with legislators about how particular bills will impact ourselves, the communities that we serve, our respective organizations, et cetera. And committee action takes place for several weeks. So that everything needed to be wrapped up this year for House bills by close to the end of February, and for Senate bills just shortly after. And then if the bill has made it through a committee, and with that said, they only hear a small percentage of the bills that have actually been introduced and referred to committees. They really, I mean, it's up to the discretion of the committee chair to decide which bills are going to receive a hearing and which are not. So it's already a great milestone to see if a bill has made it already through committee. That's a big hurdle. And then it's sent for a second reading. Now, what that is it's going to go to the full chamber. So if it's a House bill, it's going to be sent to the full House. If it's a Senate bill, it's going to be sent to the full Senate chamber. And then it'll have its second reading. That's an opportunity for members of the full legislature to be able to make further amendments. The amendments can be placed during committee action. Committee members can make amendments or changes, but then also there's another opportunity for more amendments to be made during the second reading. Once those amendments have been heard, then it's going to ultimately go for a third reading, which is just ultimate passage through that initial House of Origin or Chamber of Origin. As I mentioned before, this is essentially the midpoint, halftime, if you will, of the legislature. And so this was about February 27th for House bills, February 28th for Senate bills. Those were the deadlines for the third reading. So if bills have already gotten through that far, as you remember probably from Schoolhouse Rock, you know, he was always saying just how hard it is, and you have to wait to, you know, actually become a law. You have to go through that all over again. It's then sent to the second chamber. So all Senate bills that have passed through the Senate are then sent to the House. All House bills that have passed through the House are now sent through the Senate, and they have to go through that exact same process all over again. The reason, checks and balances, of course, I'm sure you remember the term from high school, to make sure, you know, that enough eyes have been able to see these bills and make decisions and changes to them. So let's say a bill goes all the way through the second chamber if it has no changes made and that second chamber is like, yep, this looks a-okay to us, then it's sent directly to the governor. If there are changes made, so if further amendments are made, or, you know, they remove language or add in new language, then it would have to go to a conference committee. That's where a very small group of senators and House representatives representing both parties in most cases will meet together and then iron out any of those changes that have been made. And so that happens in the conference committee. And sometimes, and I'll explain more on this in a little bit and share an example with you, sometimes major changes are made in conference committees where they might take the full language of a dead bill and insert it into a still existing bill. So it's a really interesting, somewhat sneaky sometimes process to be able to get legislation passed. But, you know, it's still good that, you know, both chambers still come together to be able to come up with that agreement. So with that said, I'll kind of go through these. These are just the deadlines. Conference committee deadline was, well, basically conference committees take place basically the last 2.5 weeks of session. Once it passes through all of this, then it goes to the governor. And then he has 3 options. In most cases, he will sign the bill into law. The bill, you know, once it has his signature, it becomes a law. Alternatively, he could veto a bill. If he doesn't agree with it, or if he thinks that, you know, this bill is not necessary, he can veto it, and then the bill is then dead. We saw that happen in 2022 with a trans participation in school sports that would prevent trans girls from participating in school sports on the girls' teams. He did veto that bill, which, you know, McCoy, we were very pleased to see. Although, of course, then the legislature does have the opportunity to set up special sessions where they can override the veto, which is also what we saw, unfortunately, happen with that particular bill. Lastly, the governor could always just let the bill pass into law without his signature. This happens very rarely and probably only for maybe political reasons, but that's another option that he has. So with that said, if you haven't navigated the Indiana General Assembly website before, I highly recommend when you have some free time, especially during the legislative session, to check it out. And you can see, all of the bills that have been introduced, read them. You can see recordings of committee hearings that took place to discuss them. During the legislative session, you can see actual live committee hearings and everything like that. So with that said, this is what the General Assembly website looks like. You can find it at iga.in.gov. And this is essentially your homepage here. Just a second. Okay. And so you can see I kind of highlighted at the top where it says legislation. If you click on that, a drop down appears. And then there's the top option is bills. That's where you can click and see all of the bills that have been introduced. So there's the arrow to point that out. During the legislative session on the right side here, where it says like upcoming meetings, obviously no meetings are currently scheduled around this time because they're not in session. But when they are in session, you can see what meetings are scheduled for the day. And you can even click on the video cameras that they have next to each meeting to be able to see live web coverage of that particular meeting. It's a great way to basically stay transparent and open with members of the public who can't otherwise be at the State House. That said, when you click on the bills, you're going to see all of these bills pop up. These are for the 2023 session. If you want, you can search for previous years as well on this page, but you'll see Senate bills are all listed on the left, House bills are all listed on the right. This is a screenshot, obviously, but if you scroll down, you can scroll down for a while. There are a lot of bills. But I will just share that any bills that are blue, those are bills that are alive. And at this point, they are now have been passed into law. If they are gray, those bills were introduced but died. They didn't make it to that final finish line. This is another website I recommend. This is one that I was checking a lot towards the end of the legislative session. This is Governor Holcomb's Bill Watch. It has this very long URL here at the top, which if you have the time, obviously we'll share, this recording with you so you can see this, but also just the easiest way is just to Google Governor Holcomb Bill Watch 2023. It'll be the first thing that pops up in Google or whatever your search engine is. But basically, this has a list of all of the bills that have been introduced. If it says SEA, that was a Senate enrolled act. That means it was originally a Senate bill. It's now been enrolled. And you can see the date that it was received by the governor, and then the date that he signed it as well. He has about 7 days to be able to sign each law. So you'll see also the due date. But that's just another good way to kind of see what bills have made it to his desk. Lastly, if you go back to the IGA website, iga.in.gov, if you click on one of those bills that I showed you in two previous screens, if you clicked on one of those, the blue bills, meaning the alive bills, then you can see all sorts of information on the left side. Bill details shows kind of the summary of what the bill includes. You can see the latest version, which is the actual full legal official text of the bill. But this particular one that I have highlighted here is the bill actions. If it has passed into law, you'll see what I circled here is as of May 4th, 2023, it has been signed in as Public Law 201. And then you can kind of see chronologically how it's moved through the Senate and the House and the full General Assembly. So I will move along to discuss some of the new laws of interest to youth advocates. So as I mentioned, I work for Marion County Commission on Youth. So as their advocacy director, we advocate for any issues that impact children, families, or people who serve children and families. So this is all sorts of stuff. I kind of joke around and I try my best to be a jack of all trades and a master of none. I let the others in our community who have the expertise and lived experience and things like that to kind of inform me and educate me when I show up to the State House. So with that said, I'm so glad that so many of you are here today, because you are the people that I want to hear from to make sure that the testimony that I share is accurate and informative and useful for the Senate and the House. But with that said, as I mentioned, hundreds and hundreds of bills have been introduced. Only a small amount, probably I would say 10-15% actually pass into law. But these are ones that I wanted to highlight that have passed into law. They're certainly not all of them, but these are ones of note that I was really following and tracking along this year. So this first one is House Bill 1485. It's titled Discipline Rules Regarding Bullying. We were very pleased to see that this had bipartisan support in both chambers. Basically, it's going to require Indiana schools to update their discipline rules starting on July 1st. July 1st is when a lot of these laws take into effect. They need to include provisions prioritizing the safety of bullying victims, as well as to ensure bullying incidents are reported to the parents of the victim and the alleged perpetrator no more than 5 business days following the incident, instead of in a merely expedited manner, which is how before it was. It also permits school corporations to include in their discipline rules specific guidelines for determining whether a bullying incident warrants the actual transfer of the victim or of the alleged perpetrator to a different school. This was introduced by Senator Lonnie Randolph, who had a constituent reach out to him because their child, it's very tragic, had died by suicide because of bullying. The parents were never notified about it. Family members came to testify on it. It was absolutely heartbreaking, but we were glad to see that this is a step in the right direction to make sure that parents are notified if a child is being bullied, and also if their child is the bully, so that proper procedures can take place. As I mentioned, this will take place, it went into effect on July 1st, so it's going to obviously start going into effect this upcoming school year. For each of these slides, also just a bit of background, I included kind of the impact that I'm foreseeing, but then also additional needed supports for youth service providers like yourselves to just kind of be aware of, what sort of supports are going to be needed to really properly execute these laws. So with that said, with the impacts, we're hoping that there might be a change in number of reporting bullying instances. We know that a lot of bullying goes unreported, whether because it's happening online or a child doesn't feel comfortable going to an adult about bullying instances. But we're hoping that this can increase the feeling of safety for a child who's a victim of bullying to be able to report these. And also with that said, a change in the number of children reporting feeling depressed or suicidal, that number might hopefully change for the better because they have supportive adults in their lives who can help them through these tough times. With that said, we'll need to see school personnel educated about bullying and to be able to recognize when they're seeing bullying. And also we need youth to be educated to recognize and report bullying if they see their peers going through that. Another bill, House Bill 1558, this is called the Science of Reading. Beginning with the 2024 and 2025 school year, so there's a bit of a delay in order to kind of prepare teachers to implement this. Schools will need to adopt curriculum or supplemental materials for reading that are aligned with the science of reading, which is, a peer-reviewed, proven best practice for teaching children how to read. They may not adopt curriculum or supplemental materials for reading that are based on the 3 cueing model. Now, I'm not a teacher myself, so I'm sure any teachers that are here today will kind of be able to understand the differences between those, but it's going to just ensure that the best practices for teaching children to read are implemented at schools. With that said, we really hope that there's going to be an impact of improved literacy rates for youth in our state. But with that said, supports will be needed. Proper training for existing teachers on the science of reading, any teachers that may not already be familiar with this method. And then obviously there will need to be updated curriculum for schools of education who are educating the future teachers who are going to be implementing this. Another needed support too, I mean, you'll probably see regularly, is just funding. We need money to be able to make sure that teachers have the resources and supports to be able to implement these new procedures. Senate Bill 167 is called FAFSA. We were very excited to see this pass. This has been a bill that's been introduced. Something similar to it has been introduced, I think, every year that I've been at McCoy now. But it finally has passed into law, which we're very excited about. It seemed this year that legislators really want to make sure that young people are prepared to enter, to go to college or to enter the workforce upon graduation, but prepared to kind of enter adulthood with the skills needed to succeed. So with that said, FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid, that a lot of students never fill it out because they don't know how to do it. So they don't have the supports. And so because of that, a lot of scholarship money, student loan money goes unclaimed that could be otherwise used to help young people seek higher education. So this will require high school students in their senior year to complete and submit the FAFSA no later than April 15th. In my personal opinion, I feel like that's a little late because hopefully by April of their senior year, they'll have an idea of, where they're headed the next year, but at least this has the requirement. They do have the option of opting out if they know what the FAFSA is and they really don't want to fill it out. They do have that option. But with that said, they'll need to file it if they want to be considered for certain federal financial benefits, such as grants, loans, and scholarships. This will go into effect this upcoming school year, and it will expire in 2033. So this is kind of on a 10-year basis. I think legislators wanted to have an expiration date just in case it's not successful and for whatever reason. If it is successful, then we hope that we'll see that it's renewed. But they wanted to kind of have an exit ramp just in case. So with that said, obviously there's going to be some numbers impacts in terms of how many students actually fill out the FAFSA, how many students are enrolling in higher education. And also I'm excited to see how much scholarship money is awarded to students throughout the state. With that said, though, there needs to be a lot of supports to help students throughout this process. Increased education on student loans and student loan forgiveness and paying off debt. I am still paying off my student loans, and I really wish I had a bit more education myself in my high school years and even in college and before grad school to understand kind of what it meant to take out loans and how I can best pay off these loans. There also needs to be increased supports for other financial needs that aren't covered by grants, loans, and scholarships. The FAFSA could provide funding for some things, but also, just increased knowledge of what's out there to be able to pay for the rest of your curriculum. Also, training for school personnel to support students and families with filling out the FAFSA. This is going to be new for schools across the state to be able to fill out this requirement. And so obviously, schools will need to have proper training. And with that said, also support to ensure that there's privacy with familial financial matters. I believe when filling out the FAFSA, you need to kind of pry into, parents' income and things like that, and just mindfulness of being respectful of that privacy. All right, this bill, hang on just a second. All right, Senate Bill 35 is financial literacy. This is another bill that has been introduced and passed into law, again, to better prepare young people as they enter adulthood. I wish I had a financial literacy course myself for the reasons that I was just explaining, student loans and debt and things like that. But basically, this is a new bill that will require students to successfully complete a personal financial responsibility course before they graduate. This must be offered as a separate subject course, and it's going to start with students who are scheduled to graduate in 2028. I did a little bit of backwards math, and I figured out those are current rising eighth graders. So kids who are going into their eighth grade year this upcoming year, that's the group of kids that are going to be required to start taking this financial literacy class. Oops, let me go back. All right. With that said, with the impact, we'll see a lot. Well, hopefully, maybe the number of youth who have bank accounts, that number might increase. Student loans, understanding. Well, I guess we'll see kind of how that number changes, if more loans are taken out, if different loans are taken out, and things like that. Youth who understand how to save money and invest money, especially as they're entering adulthood. And then there could be even long-term effects. These are just kind of my own speculations, but perhaps an increased number of homeowners, perhaps an increased number of business owners, because they entered adulthood with this background knowledge of financial responsibility. The needed supports, though, is ensuring that curriculum is consistent and non-biased. There were concerns that, there might be actual bank personnel showing up, in schools to share information about, my XYZ bank is the best bank to invest in and things like that. So we want to make sure, that everything is given in a non-biased way so that young people, students are able to approach their own financial well-being in the way of their choosing. With that said, also proper training for teachers to teach these subjects. And lastly, again, funding for schools to create curriculum for new course. Funding. Schools need more money. And especially when these new bills are placed onto schools, they need to have some sort of financial supports to be able to back that. This is another one. I'm sharing a lot of good news ones right now. House Bill 1449 is the 21st Century Scholars Program. Some of you may be well familiar with this program. It's a great program that provides full funding for college for students who are low income. So this particular policy will automatically enroll eligible Hoosier students in the 21st Century Scholars Program, which, as I mentioned, provides up to 100% tuition for public state colleges in Indiana for low-income students. We're super excited to see this. I was looking actually at the IYI Kids Count data book to see how many Hoosier students actually enroll in this versus how many are actually qualified to enroll. And the number up until this point, has been way off, specifically also disproportionately affecting students of color who are not enrolled in the program who qualify for it. So we're really excited to see that this will automatically enroll eligible Hoosiers and break down those barriers to be able to participate in this program. So with that said, we are really hopeful to see the numbers of students who enroll in the program will increase. The number of students who graduate college because of the supports from this program. We're really hoping that increases. With that said, obviously, there's always supports that are going to be needed. Education for qualifying students on what the program is and how to remain a 21st Century Scholar. If anybody here has participated in the 21st Century Scholarship Program, I know that there are some guidelines where you need to maintain a particular grade point average. You can't get into any trouble, no drugs or alcohol abuse and things like that. So making sure that children or young people are aware of those requirements in order to maintain their scholarship. Again, also education for teachers and faculty members on how to share information on this program so that not only the students are familiar, but also parents are familiar with what's available. The Department of Education will need support to identify and enroll qualifying students, and then also support and education for scholars on what school fees are not included from the program. This is something that I heard from another 21st Century Scholar graduate who wasn't aware, that there's still, even though 100% of tuition is covered, there's certain things that might not be covered, like book fees or living expenses and things like that. So understanding what is and is not covered so that a student can enter their secondary or college years with that preparation. All right, now we're going to jump into a couple of juvenile justice bills. House Bill 1493, super excited to see a lot of bipartisan support on this one. Elimination of costs and fees in juvenile courts. Does just that. It removes court fees and fines in the juvenile court if it determines that a family is unable to pay. We found out this year through this bill that a lot of court fees and fines go unpaid, and a lot of resources are spent trying to track down families to get this money, but ultimately they're spending more money to track down families than to just waive the fees altogether. So we're super excited to see that this goes into effect on July 1st. It will break down barriers for young people as they re-enter society after incarceration. It will also provide supports for their families so that they don't have this additional hardship of financial burden. So with that said, impact that I'm guessing you will, hopefully see maybe a change in juvenile recidivism, because ultimately when somebody re-enters society after incarceration and then they're strapped with these added debts, then who knows what sort of methods might be used in order to try and come up with the money to be able to pay this off. So we're hoping that maybe this could impact recidivism and just really add just more supports for families and young people who really need it. With that said, we'll need to be able to educate families about this fee waiving. So for public defenders and other prosecutors to be able to work with their clients, to be able to educate those families about these changes. With that said, again, education to legal teams and judges on the impacts of the removal of these financial barriers and burdens to families as well. All right, this is another juvenile justice bill that we were following and tracking too. Senate Bill 415. The name eventually changed to just juveniles in general, but originally it was called admissibility of a statement by a juvenile in custody. I found out this year that up until this bill had been passed, it was perfectly legal for police officers to lie or use deceptive tactics to be able to get a confession out of a child in juvenile custody. Is perfectly acceptable. And we know that through data and research that children oftentimes give false confessions because they're naturally more respectful for positions of authority. And so it's a very scary process. And if you're being told like, hey, you just tell me you did it and I'll let you go home. If you use deceptive practices like that, then there's a much stronger likelihood of getting a false confession. So with that said, this bill provides that any statement made by a juvenile during custodial interrogation in response to a materially false statement from a law enforcement officer is inadmissible against the juvenile. So if a juvenile is lied to, knowingly lied to, then any statement that they make after in response to that lie is going to be determined to be inadmissible. And won't be used against them. They added on another amendment that would require a law enforcement officer who arrests or takes into custody a child on school property. They must notify or request a school administrator to notify the child's parent or guardian or emergency contact that the child has been arrested and will be removed from the school property. So that's just another kind of additional thing. So with that said, as I mentioned, the impact, we're really hoping that the number of false juvenile confessions will go down. And hopefully this will increase and improve the general conception and trust of the police between young people and police officers. With needed supports, youth should be educated on their rights. If they're arrested, they should know, when they can and cannot speak and things like that, and just be educated on proper interactions and things like that with police officers. All right. Those of you probably remember around this time last year, the legislative session, the legislature went back into session for a special session in response to the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade. And so because of abortion potentially becoming illegal in the state of Indiana, legislators really wanted to increase ways to prevent unwanted pregnancies and to support people who from having unwanted pregnancies. So with that said, there have been a lot of bills introduced to increase access to contraceptives. So these two, in particular, I highlighted. There's House Bill 252, which allows a long-acting reversible contraceptive, or probably like an IUD, that is prescribed to and obtained for a Medicaid patient, a Medicaid recipient to be recipient. So this increases access to long-term reversible contraceptives for people who may need financially be unable to oh gosh, I keep going back to pay for it. Again, then also there's House Bill 1568. This went into effect on July 1st, but it allows pharmacists and not just physicians to prescribe hormonal contraceptives such as the patch or the pill. The law limits birth control prescriptions from pharmacists to no more than 6 months, and pharmacists cannot prescribe the contraceptive to a woman after 12 months unless the woman has been seen by a physician. So this increases access for people to receive contraceptives, especially, we're looking at in particular rural areas where it might be a long drive for a person to go to their doctor to be able to get a prescription like this. They could alternatively go down the street to CVS or Walgreens, be able to get a prescription, at least up until the next time that they're able to get to their doctor. So this just expands more access to contraceptives. So with that said, we're hoping that there might be a change in the number of unwanted pregnancies. Clearly, there will be increased access to contraceptives. But with that said, there's certainly needed supports. Everybody just needs to be educated on how and where to access contraceptives if that's something that's appropriate for them. Always need increased sexual education, the peer-reviewed, fact-based sexual education. And then, of course, education too on the limitations of this new bill. People who do go to a pharmacist to be able to get this prescription should know that, this is only for a finite amount of time, and they eventually do need to see a doctor to be able to continue receiving this medication. All right, I also wanted to highlight a couple just kind of social services bills that had been passed. Senate Bill 265 on TANF eligibility, the temporary assistance for needy families. It expands eligibility to qualify for TANF, which had not been updated since 1988. Think about where you were in 1988. Were you even alive? A lot of us might not have been. And so considering that it hasn't been updated since 1988, this is going to be a big step in the right direction to provide needed services and supports for families who need it. It's going to be raising from 15% of the federal poverty level to 50% of the federal poverty level over the next 4 years. So this will just give more supports to families who need them. Up until now, you had to be extremely poor to qualify for TANF. And if you did qualify for TANF, you would get the same amount of supports as a family would have in 1988. So think about how much milk cost in 1988 versus now, how much a tank of gas cost, how those numbers have obviously changed. We need to make sure that the eligibility requirements, and then the amounts of benefits that families receive are adjusted accordingly as well. And then Senate Bill 334 is the simplified application for SNAP benefits. This simplifies the application and recertification process for SNAP benefits for the elderly and those with disabilities and their families. Though this doesn't, clearly state young people, is, as I mentioned at McCoy, we advocate for young people, their families, and all those who serve their families. So a lot of young people live with the elderly or with parents with disabilities. And so we just want to make sure that all families receive the benefits that they're needed. So we certainly hope that there's going to be an increase in the number of families who receive these benefits. Maybe even the number of families in extreme poverty will hopefully go down. The number of families experiencing hunger will hopefully go down. But with that said, again, we need lots of supports to help families enroll in these programs who aren't already enrolled, and supports to get more service providers to assist families with enrollment. All right, so now I will go into some of the kind of sadder things. I mean, if you watch the news, you kind of see what the hot topics of the day are. And this year in the Indiana State Legislature, there was no exception. There were several bills introduced and passed that will impact our LGBTQIA youth in Indiana. The first that I will talk about is 1608, which is titled Human Sexuality Instruction. This was Indiana's version of the Don't Say Gay bill. It provides that instruction on human sexuality is not permitted in schools between pre-K and third grade. There's a lot of vagueness though. First of all, human sexuality and sex ed isn't taught in schools typically until about at least fifth grade, fourth or fifth grade. But with that said, there's still a lot of vagueness too, in terms of, if a teacher shows up who's pregnant and their kindergarten student asks them about that, are they allowed to talk about it and things like that? There's just a lot of vagueness, and that uncertainty can be obviously quite scary for teachers and for schools. It also requires a school to notify at least one parent if a student makes a request to change their preferred name or pronoun. This obviously impacts the LGBTQ community. If a child is questioning their gender identity and want to be, referred to by a different pronoun or even a different name, a parent needs to be notified of that. We have strong problems with that because some children feel comfortable being their true selves at school, but they still don't have that safe space at home. And so by having to notify parents, that effectively outs the child who might not want their parents to know about this, what they're going through at the time. And also, I will say too, what's interesting too about the bill is even if it doesn't have anything to do with, you identifying as a different gender or anything like that, if your name is Catherine and you want to go by Kate, a parent needs to be notified. If you then want to change from Kate to Katie, that parent needs to be notified. And so it just puts on this undue hardship for something, that is absolutely harmless in my opinion. And so this does go into effect July 1st, so we're going to start seeing this impacting students and teachers this upcoming school year. With that said, number of students experiencing bullying, depression, thoughts of suicide, that might be an impact of this, is because students might not feel comfortable asking a teacher or another faculty member to call them by their preferred name or pronoun. That continues to kind of keep them hidden from their true identity, and will therefore have serious mental health consequences. There will be diminished trust between students and teachers. Students might currently feel comfortable talking openly to a teacher, but now they'll feel a little nervous about whether or not is this teacher going to notify a teacher or their parents about this decision on their behalf. So with that said, needed supports. education, training, and support for non-school youth service providers to offer safe and affirming spaces for youth, and education of youth to know their rights and to understand the new policies. Young people are going to need to know that if you ask of this change, what is this going to mean? But with that said, also for anybody here listening in, if you are a youth service provider who works with youth outside of the school setting, it's going to be really important now more than ever after this legislative session to be able to create safe and affirming spaces where kids can come to and be open and trusting and have a trusted mentor and adults in their lives. Senate Bill 480 is another one that impacts trans youth in our state. It's titled Gender Transition Procedures for Minors, and basically it prohibits physicians from knowingly providing gender transition procedures to an individual who's less than 18 years of age. This includes social transitioning care, access to puberty blockers, hormone replacement therapies, all of which are generally considered to be reversible, time-tested treatments. Those are all going to be denied also. It also will prevent any sort of surgical intervention, which in Indiana, it doesn't take place for anybody who's under the age of 18. But with that said, that has also been removed. You probably maybe have seen information about this in the news, but the ACLU has filed a lawsuit against this measure on behalf of 4 transgender minors. And currently a federal judge issued an order in mid-June that would stop this ban on puberty blockers and hormones for transgender minors from taking effect on July 1st. So with that said, it's still kind of in limbo. It's currently blocked, which is, we were excited to see, but we're not really sure what's going to happen next. But we're definitely keeping a close eye from the ACLU on further guidelines and things. The impact, number of families who leave the state. If, a family is affirming and providing a safe, welcoming space for their child who's trans, and then their child is now being denied this life-saving healthcare, then I expect that many families will opt to move into a state that will welcome them and will support them in the health decisions for them and their families. Also, depression and suicide rates for trans youth expect to go up. Already, we're already seeing a lot of trans youth are feeling the repercussions of just seeing these bills be introduced. That would just essentially make their existence illegal. And so, just seeing those numbers change is certainly going to be an impact. With that said, again, I'm just going to say it again, we need all youth serving organizations that are able to provide safe, affirming spaces for trans youth. There needs to be guidance on healthcare options for trans youth if and when this law goes into effect, and also supports for families who do want to provide affirming healthcare for their children. And I don't know what that looks like currently, but we're certainly going to be keeping a close eye on how these families and children can be supported. All right, this is one of the examples of the bills that I was kind of referring to earlier when I was discussing how a bill can become a law. Oh gosh, I'm realizing we're getting close to time, so I'll try and be fast. Senate Bill 12, Material Harmful to Minors, was a bill that was introduced in the Senate. It passed the Senate. It never got a hearing in the House, so it effectively died. It wasn't until the second half of session they tried to take language from this dead bill, reinsert it into a still existing House bill. And that amendment ended up failing. And then they took this, the same language from Senate Bill 12 and then reinserted it into another education bill that was already in the conference committee. So think about, earlier when we were looking at the timeline of how a bill becomes a law, the conference committee is the last step before it goes to the governor's office. It was during that time that they took language from this dead bill, they put it into another completely different bill right before it was headed to the governor's office, which is just, I don't know, it's a little wild to me that that's able to be done, but it was. So basically, this classifies literature that's deemed harmful to minors under the same umbrella as certain books with obscenities like pornography that are already not allowed. Librarians who violate this law could be charged with a level 6 felony, which includes up to 2.5 years in jail with a $10,000 fine. This will require school libraries to establish a book review process, which is a measure already present in most libraries. And most librarians that I've heard from don't have a problem with having a book review process. The scary thing, though, is opening up librarians to prosecution if they do have, a book that might be offensive to some. Now, the problem is the books that tend to be challenged are oftentimes books that include characters that are LGBTQIA, or also characters who are minorities, books that discuss race and racism. Those are oftentimes the books that are challenged. And for a lot of times, these are books that are necessary to be educational, to be in libraries so that students and young people have access to literature that is representative of their lived experience. So, we're at McCoy, we were certainly opposed to this. And so it'll be interesting to see how this actually goes into effect. But with that said, we'll probably expect a higher number of book challenges made to libraries. The accessibility of books might be impacted that reflect diverse perspectives. And so librarians really need to know what their rights are. And then a common understanding of the policies in place at each library for people who do bring up book challenges. That education needs to be dispelled. All right, this is the last one, I promise. The House Bill 1001 was the House budget. This is just only a tiny, tiny fraction of what the House budget actually entails. But basically this past year, we passed this budget that will cover Indiana's budget over the next 2 years. Just a few notes of impact in terms of how it's going to affect young people and youth service providers and schools. It greatly expands Indiana's private school voucher program. It injects significant investments into the mental health response system and public health initiatives. So we were pleased to see that. The per student public education funding received increases. So schools will see $8.84 billion for tuition support in 2024, a little over $9 billion in 2025. There's also a funding increase for On My Way Pre-K, which we were pleased to see. And our friends at United Way of Central Indiana really led the effort on expanding that. So with that said, we'll see there will likely be a change in enrollment into private schools, increased access to On My Way Pre-K program. With that increased access, there's going to be an increased need for childcare workers. I think that goes without saying, as we always need more childcare workers and accessible, quality childcare places, in the state. But also, with that expanded On My Way Pre-K, improved preparedness for children as they enter kindergarten. Needed supports, expansion for qualified mental health professionals to serve Hoosiers. Now that there's been more money funded towards addressing mental health responses in our state, we certainly want to see an expanded supports in that way. Recruitment and retention of quality childcare providers, that's always going to be needed. And expanded recruitment of qualifying families to participate in the On My Way Pre-K program. All right, I will leave it there, and I'm happy to take any questions. I've seen some movement in the chat, although I haven't seen the actual comments. But again, you have my contact information here. There's a link. We have all sorts of great advocacy resources on McCoy's website. Also, highly recommend, if you aren't already signed up, to follow Sarah's State House Sound Off. That's my weekly newsletter that goes out during the legislative session on Fridays, typically Friday midday. And periodically you'll get some emails here and there, like throughout the year, but mostly it's just every week during the legislative session on what's happened at the State House that week. that impacts children and families.
Yep, so we are right at time. There were a couple questions that we won't be able to get to. I tried to answer some in the chat. But as Sarah said, you are more than welcome to email her or check on McCoy's website to see if you can find your answer there. And so with that, I just want to thank Sarah for the great information and the update that she provided. And so we're going to end there. I'm going to go over a couple of things with IYI that we have coming up, and then we'll get you out of here. So as a reminder, a copy of the PowerPoints will be emailed to you, as well as Aaron put a link in the chat. A couple things, we strongly suggest that you sign up for our newsletter. It's the best way to be up to date on events, data, information, everything IYI and everything youth work. So please check that out. Some upcoming events. The big one is our Kids Count Conference coming November 14th and 15th, 2023. Registration will be open in several weeks, and we have some cool announcements regarding that coming up. Upcoming webinars. Our next webinar is August 16th. It's Stop the Trauma, Call to Action on Trauma-Informed Care for Youth. And then September and October, we have The Kids Are Not Okay, and then Youth Worker Wellbeing in Indiana, a New Approach. Just as a reminder, we have professional development grants that you can submit at any time. If you have questions about that, you can go to IYI.org. And then finally, I just want to thank everyone, all of the attendees that joined us today. We appreciate your impact and we value your voice and the choice you made to learn and partner with IYI today. Later on, today or tomorrow, you will receive an email with a link to complete an evaluation of this webinar. Please take a few minutes to let us know what you thought about today's presentation. If you don't receive the evaluation email, please check your junk email. Sometimes it goes there. And then once you complete the evaluation, you will be redirected to your certificate of completion, which I know some folks need. So that concludes our presentation. And on behalf of Indiana's youth, thank you so much for showing up today and every day for Indiana youth.